All right, well, it is a pleasure to be back with you all again, and I am confident that I'm going to leave this place 10 pounds heavier than when I got here. There is no doubt in that. So during this study, as we talk about this idea of a living sacrifice, we've looked at how this starts with the recognition that I must surrender my will to the will of God. I need to acknowledge that, and I need to actively seek to bend my will to God's will. And then we looked at in the second lesson about how that is sustained, and that is sustained through the renewing of our mind, and how that is the only way, through the renewing of my mind is the only way I'm able to keep myself spiritually on that altar, so that I am constantly living my life as a spiritual sacrifice. But then the question comes up, so what does this actually look up in my everyday, how does this look in my everyday life? What does that transformed life look like Monday and Tuesday and then every other day of the week as I am just walking through my daily life? How does that represent itself? And what pieces of that can I use as a litmus test to be able to judge, am I moving on toward that continual sacrifice? It's easy for us to talk about sacrifice. It's easy to represent that I'm living my life as such, but put into practice, that takes devotion, it takes effort, and it takes constant evaluation to recognize whether or not I'm actually living that sacrificial lifestyle, or am I just getting caught up in the world opposed to living the godly lifestyle? And it's harder to live that out in the ordinary moments when maybe your guard's down. And maybe you're under pressure, and those moments seep into where you could then act in a way that would demonstrate that I'm not giving myself as a sacrifice, and I'm living worldly just as everybody else is. So it's really revealed in those moments, in those everyday lives that we may characterize as not being spiritual moments. But we're going to talk about that tonight. We're going to see if there is there an actual divide between what we would maybe consider those sacred moments or those spiritual moments, and then that everyday life, that separate part of our life. At least that's how it could be interpreted. But if you would, go ahead and turn to Romans 12. Let's go ahead and look back at our passage again, Romans 12, 1 and 2. Paul says here, I beseech you therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you present your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service. And do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. So we talked about it yesterday a little bit, about the idea about presenting our bodies, and how we could easily use that as a way to view our entire life, our entire mechanism, and how we live, and how in the use of that as a living sacrifice, we demonstrate how our will is being directed. Are we the ones directing our will in accordance to what gives us joy, or are we aligning our will with what God would have us to do? So it's not just our mind, and it's not just the time that we spend at worship, and those are definitely important things, but it is our entire life. It is every action that we take becomes part of that offering that we give. Every single action. There's no real deviation between spiritual and the everyday life. All aspects of our life are God's concern. If you would flip to 1 Corinthians chapter 10. 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Looking there at verse 31 through 33, Paul here dealing with, talking about going to eat at someone's house. Don't ask about if it's offered to idols. Don't ask for conscience sake. But if it is, and you're brought to be aware of that, then don't eat it for their conscience. You know that all things are clean under God. All things were made by God. But in 31 through 33, he says, therefore, whether you eat or drink, or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense either to the Jews or to the Greeks or to the church of God, just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. Paul mentions here eating and drinking. This is characterizing our ordinary life. These are all things that I do. This is where there is nothing outside of God's concern. I had this erroneous belief for a long time that I needed some balance, that I needed to have, I would put God in one section and I would study His Word, and that would help me, in my spiritual life, but I still needed to be really focused on that worldly stuff. I still needed to be focused on the job, getting ahead, making the money, whatever it was that from a worldly perspective would put me ahead. I still needed to kind of separate the two. But that's not at all what we see here. We often can divide our life into two sections. We can have who we are when we're being spiritually minded, and then who we are in front of our coworkers, or who we are in front of our friends who are maybe not in the church. But Scripture doesn't make that distinction at all. And coming to realize that for myself was a real kick. To realize that I had been doing something that now I've come to realize is totally erroneous, that this balance that I thought I needed was just wrong, and that I needed to make sure that everything that I did in my regular life was filtered through a spiritual lens. Because if I'm living this spiritual life as a spiritual sacrifice, every action, every thought, every moment that I have with somebody, that is either on the altar or it is not. The real point to this is the fact that that spiritual sacrificial lifestyle, it does not have an on and off switch. There's no pause. It needs to be on always. And it's just not what our world teaches. Our world teaches balance. It teaches there's a time for God, there's a time for this, a time for that, there's a time for youth sports, because those are really important. And what I'm learning is that is just not the truth. Every single action, everything we do needs to be filtered through the lens of, is this me staying on the altar? So if every part of my life matters when it comes to either I'm living a sacrificial life or I'm not, what are places that I can judge to see if I'm staying on course or am I getting off? And I think one of the easiest ways for a lot of us, who have held secular jobs, or those who still do, I mean, when we really view our work as a service to God, that can really help improve our judgment in the things that we're doing, to see if we are living our life as an actual sacrifice. If you would turn to Colossians 3 for me. Colossians 3, 23 through 24. This coming off of a section where Paul is exhorting them to, wives to submit to your husbands, and then, as fitting to the Lord, husbands to your wives, and kids obey your parents in the world. And then, of course, us fathers, let's not provoke our children to wrath. That's not something we should do, right? We don't provoke them lest they get discouraged. And then he hits this in verse 22, bondservants. Obey all things your masters bondservants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh, not with eye service as men pleasers, but in sincerity of heart, fearing God. And whatever you do, do it heartily as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the reward of your inheritance, for you serve the Lord Christ. And so when I view this through the lens of who I serve, right? And I cut that a little bit short, because if you look there in verse 25, but he who does wrong will be repaid for what he has done, and there is no partiality. Right? So if there is no partiality, and how, we don't have bond servants today, but we can just think of them as our bosses, or those who would have any authority over us, how we then act to them, how we respond to them when no one's watching, would need to be filtered through that, am I living this life sacrificially? And it's not when it's just convenient, because when it's convenient, that's when it's easy to be the sacrifice. When I'm already posted up there and I'm in that zone where everything is going the way I think it needs to go, it's easy to live that. But when it's not convenient, when there's a way to do a job that maybe I end up with the same results, but it's not the way I'm supposed to do it, do I choose to do it the way I'm instructed over the easy route when no one's watching and no one would find out? But it's those little moments to where no one would know but you and God do you choose then to do the right thing? So in that place where if I'm living my life as this living sacrifice, and I'm working and I'm putting in the energy that I know God would expect of me, when I'm doing that, then doesn't my work life become worship? I mean, not formal worship, right? But not when we all come together, but is it not a form of worship if I'm doing things wholeheartedly because God expects me to, and I'm doing it when no one's watching? Wouldn't that be pleasing to God? Because having integrity in those small things, that really exposes where our heart is. And if we take stock of that, then we see where we're truly at. Where am I at on my walk? And I can see that if in the small things I'm doing the things God would have me to do, that I know I'm on the right path. And I think about this in Luke 16:10, when we see the parable of the unjust steward, and toward the end of that, Jesus says, he who is faithful in what is least is faithful in much. So looking at what I do when no one's watching, where it's a small thing, it builds me up to know that I did the right thing when it didn't seem like there was any consequences if I did the other, but I did it anyways. Now when there's that big ask, that stand I may have to take, I've already made those small decisions on a daily basis to do the right thing. Now it's going to be easier for me to stand and live and stay on the altar where God would have me to be. Our character is built in these moments, these small moments that seem like they're nothing, and over the course of time, they shape who I am. I'm becoming more Christ-like if I'm doing the right things in these moments where no one's going to know. Because when the time comes where there's going to be those tough decisions, I need to have won those little battles. So then when that big moment comes, it's not a big deal. I don't have to think of it as crossing the Rubicon. It's just another day. It's another decision that was made before the circumstance ever arose. And what comes with that is, keeping in that vein of that work life and how we live and making good decisions all the time, there is the idea of time. And what do I do with my time? If you would turn to Ephesians for me. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 15 and 16. See then that you walk circumspectly, not as fools, but as wise, redeeming the time because the days are evil. Now, Mr. Jimmy, I don't know the last time someone asked you about walking circumspectly. Right? I mean, that's not language we use, right? It's one of those things where if you don't search this out, you're not going to get the meaning. Living cautiously vigilant. Like that's a whole different meaning. With moral accuracy. Having spiritual awareness in all the things that I do, looking on all sides, being fully aware of everything that's going on around me. That's what walking circumspectly means. So Paul is urging believers to carefully examine their behavior to avoid spiritual traps and pitfalls, and do so honoring God's will. So if I'm to live my life that way, and I'm to do that redeeming the time, doesn't what I spend my time on expose who my master is? And we mentioned this in the Bible study on Sunday morning about how quickly and easily you can just doom scroll and 2 or 3 hours go by and you haven't done anything inherently sinful. I mean, all you did was scroll. But you're not walking circumspectly. You're not redeeming the time. You're wasting time. And we're all guilty of this. So what I value and what I truly love and things that I'm truly concerned about, that reveals itself in the amount of time that I spend on those things. I think about when I was young, I played baseball. Baseball was all that I did. It's all I cared about. Anybody who knew me knew He plays baseball. Because they knew the amount of time that I spent on it, the effort that was put into it, the hours of practice, outside of, team organized practice, individual practice with my dad. So if they knew me, they knew I played baseball. But if they were walking circumspectly, they would have realized he doesn't have any care for God at all. Because that was the truth. All I cared about was baseball. There was no time for God. I'm so blessed that I made it past that part of my life because I played in college. So, I was definitely accountable at that time. So through my actions and the things that I commit my time to, I've demonstrated to not only God, but those around me what actually matters. And if we're not focused on God and the things that would make me a better spiritual sacrifice for God, that would help me stay on that altar voluntarily, that I would repeatedly make sure that I'm staying up there, I've just exposed who my true master is. And I know for me, it wasn't baseball. It was self. That's really what it boiled down to. So a living sacrifice is seen in my work ethic. It is seen in the time that I used and then my everyday responsibilities. I'm not taking the shortcuts. I'm doing things the right way. But it's not just seen in what I do. It's not just what I do, actions I take. But I think it can be exposed most predominantly in how we speak. I think that's where, for a lot of us, we can show the pitfalls that we have in our life, where we're not necessarily living that sacrificial lifestyle. If you would turn back to Luke chapter 6 for me. Luke chapter 6 in verse 45. Starting in verse 43, Jesus says, "For a good tree does not bear bad fruit, nor does a bad tree bear good fruit. For every tree is known by its own fruits. For men do not gather figs from thorns, nor do they gather grapes from a bramble bush. A good man out of the good treasure of his heart brings forth good, and an evil man out of the evil treasure of his heart brings forth evil. For out of the abundance of the heart his mouth speaks." He's just saying what's on the inside is going to come out. I think this is one of those places that we can use as a litmus test to really gauge how far am I along this walk. Because it's that moment when you get cut off in traffic. That moment. What do you say? When that person just treats you rudely at the counter and treats you completely wrong, it is abhorrent how they treated you, how do you respond? Do you just shake it off and keep going, or is there a response? Do we get angry and we respond out back to them in a way that is unbefitting as Christians? Or do we actually respond the way God would have us to respond? Because if we're responding in a way that we wouldn't want to respond to Jesus, and that shows us where we are spiritually. That there may be just a chink in our armor that we need to fix. When you think about language, I had a horrible mouth for a very, very long time, and for me it was fairly easy to stop using foul language. But I know others who have struggled with it, whose heart is in the right place. And they are all about seeking the things of God, but they struggle with this. But they have to keep working at it, because in those moments, that habitual habit of using foul language can sneak up on you when you're unprepared. So we have to recognize that some of us we struggle with this. And we need to, again, the principle we talked about in the last lesson, about 2 Corinthians 10:5, taking every thought into captivity to the obedience of Christ, catching that thing before it comes out of us. That also would be beneficial for us so that we're not using our words to destroy people. We're using our words to build them up. As we see in Ephesians 4 in verse 29, if you'll turn to Ephesians 4 in verse 29, Paul says, "Let no corrupt word proceed out of your mouth, but what is good for necessary edification." that it may impart grace to the hearers. So, no corrupt word. I mean, it is only necessary for edification, only necessary to build people up. That means that we need to have filters, strong filters, and how we address people, because any careless speech may tear down when we're supposed to be the ones lifting people up. You know, and this has such an effect on the community around us. But what about it at the home, where there's love between two people and then a careless word? Isn't that like a knife to the heart? We should never have anything destructive come out of our mouths. Because if our speech has been used through this filter, or been put through this filter before we use it, before we verbally say anything out loud, and then now it becomes an intentional action instead of an emotional response to a situation I wasn't prepared for. You know, and this is the same idea we see in Colossians 4. He says, let your speech always be with grace, seasoned with salt, that you may know how you ought to answer each one. So a living sacrifice speaks with grace. It speaks with purpose, with restraint. And this is something I've had guidance from an individual who has helped me think about this, and it has really changed the way I speak to people. It's not all about just the words you say. Who are you talking to? And how are they going to hear you? Because I may say something that's not necessarily going to hurt their feelings from my perspective. But how are they going to hear me? What have they gone through in their life that they may take what I say and it hurt them when I'm not intentionally trying to hurt them? I'm just talking to them. But because of their past experiences, and if I can recognize who my audience is, and then change my speech to address them in a way that they can be heard, where they actually hear what I'm saying, when I may not choose the right words. But if I come at it from the right angle, they may still hear me and understand the point I'm trying to get across, when maybe I'm not choosing the best words. But if I think about how they hear me, and that's how I filter my language, we may be able to communicate better. And wouldn't that show up in our body language? Because how do we, when we're listening, do we show that we care? Or are we showing that we're just ready for this to be over with so I can go do whatever it is I got to do? Communication is mostly done with our bodies. And that sounds so weird to me, but it's true. Most of our communication is done through our body language. So our words and our manner and how we speak to people, that reveals whether I'm living my life for God as a spiritual sacrifice or not. Am I living it for myself, where I'm just concerned about my time, not worried about their feelings? Or am I living my life so that they can recognize that my life is a spiritual sacrifice? But sacrifice is not only about these actions and these words alone, but when we put them together, it also becomes about how we respond in those real situations. We live in the real world. We run with real problems. You know, we have things that happen to us that aren't good at times, and they can be difficult to manage. But I want to tell you that if we've been living our life as a daily sacrifice, as Paul says there, if we walk in the Spirit in Galatians 5:16 through 26, in that whole section, but if we're walking in the Spirit and we're not fulfilling the lust of the flesh on a daily basis, now I've begun to change who I am, and to where I don't respond to these instances that come up that catch me off guard in a way, because I have lived my life totally for God. I have totally been committed to the Spirit, to where the flesh is no longer a concern. Now, I say all that. When y'all get that figured out, please tell me how to do it completely. Like, I recognize that's a big ask, but it is what we're asked. Because it will expose where I'm at spiritually. If, when I'm wrong, do I choose patience or do I react? When I'm frustrated, and I've had a lot of things happen today, and the kid spills the milk, do I choose to be patient with them? Or do I just lash out because I'm at my wit's end? I mean, these are real things that we deal with. And how do we deal with it? Because do we choose control in that moment, or do we just lash out? And what about when I'm tempted, right? We all have the things that are individual to each of us that's my weak spot. And if I've been living my life for God as a living sacrifice, and I've been turning that down to where I'm not living for that, I'm only living for the things of the Spirit, then when those come up, then I can easily choose that obedience. But it's not going to happen the first time. This is a repetition game. This is changing my nature, right? By use of the way I live my life, that my nature then changes to where it is in accordance to the will of God opposed to my own flesh. It's not just what I say in worship, but it's what I choose every single day, every moment of the day. So that living sacrifice is proven in those minute details, those small decisions that seem like no one will know any different. So let's bring this home. Real questions we have to ask ourselves. Where is my life not reflecting the sacrificial life that God has called me to? Where are the holes? Where are the holes when I'm at work? Where do at times I take that easy road when I know I was supposed to do it a different way? And when I'm at home, do I give my all to everybody else so when I come home they just get the rags at the end of the day? To where I'm at my wit's end and they just get the bottom of the barrel? Or do I choose obedience then and I choose to live even in those tired moments the way God has called me to live? In my speech? Am I speaking to be heard the way I want to be heard, or am I just lashing out and speaking in a way that if they hear me, great. If not, I didn't necessarily say anything sinful. They'll figure it out. And then in my time. When people observe you, do they recognize that person's devoted to God? Or do they see, that's a career individual right there. He's going places. A living sacrifice is not only seen in these isolated moments. It is a culmination of everything we do. It is seen in a life that is consistently given to God in the ordinary things. And by means of repetition and use of that will to choose the right over the wrong, when the big things come, we make the right choice. So if we are truly going to continue living that sacrificial lifestyle, being that living sacrifice, we can test it in the everyday part of our life to see, are we making those right decisions? And then tomorrow night, we're going to look at how that looks in our relationships. What happens when my sacrifice involves other people? So as we kind of discussed in the first and the second one, at the end of both of them, some of us may need to stop separating life into categories. We need to understand that there's one unified life and there's one king who rules over all of it. Some of us need to start living for God outside of Sunday. That could be it. Some of us need to just find those places where we have gaps, and we need to make sure that we've given those to God as well. Because He's not just asking for our worship. He's asking for our entire life. He's asking for all of you to be lived as a living sacrifice. This evening, if you're not a Christian, it'll be the best decision you ever make. Come believing that Jesus is the Son of God. He died on the cross for your sins and was raised on the third day. Join Him in that after you've repented of your sins, and be buried in the waters of baptism and be raised to the walk in the newness of life. If you have any need, please come forward and make your need known as we stand and sing.
Are you sowing the seed?